Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Chris Bowick, and you're listening to the Lucid Learning Podcast. Lucid Learning is a podcast meant to be boring for people who have trouble sleeping. I'll be reading Wikipedia articles in a dry, boring voice. You may find some of these articles interesting, but I'll be changing topics constantly using the Wikipedia hyperlinks. I think it's fun to see where these hyperlinks take me throughout the show, and that's where the titles of the episodes come from. When I came up with this idea, I wanted to create a podcast for people to fall asleep to, and I thought, how can I make this boring on purpose? So the idea is that you will get bored of me talking about completely random topics. Don't forget to subscribe or follow this channel. I'll be posting weekly from now on. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, where I also post these in a video format. If you search Lucid Learning Podcast, it's not a recording of me in a video. It's just, I know that some podcast apps have ads that are very loud. So if you're trying to listen to this while you're falling asleep, obviously those would wake you back up. And right now you can find me on a lot of different apps. I know Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and a good bit more that I saw that I didn't even apply for. I guess they may just automatically go pull RSS feeds. If you have a topic you'd like to send in, you can email me at lucidlearningpodcast@gmail.com. And thank you for listening. We'll get right into it. Hello. So I've been clicking around on Wikipedia, found a random article called Psychro Cave. So that's what we're going to start with. Today is episode 4. And I'm a little late on this one, but that's okay. So Psychro Cave is an ancient Minoan sacred cave in Lucid Plateau in the Lucid district of eastern Crete. It's like in Greece. Psychro is associated with the Dictaean Cave, one of the putative sites of birth of Zeus. Other legends place it as the Idaean Cave on Mount Ida. According to Hesiod, Rhea gave birth to Zeus in Lyctus and hid him in a cave of Mount Aegon. Since the late 19th century, the Dictaean Cave, which is above the modern village of Psychro, has been identified with this sanctuary. The Dictaean Cave is found in Greek mythology as the place where Amalthea nurtured the infant Zeus with her goat's milk. The archaeology attests to the site's long use as a place of cult worship. And we're going to go to cult. So cult is literally the care in Latin, owed to deities and to temples, shrines, or churches. Cult is embodied in ritual and ceremony. Its present or former presence is made concrete in temples, shrines, and churches, and cult images, including cult images and votive offerings at votive sites. Cicero, or the cultivation of the gods. The cultivation necessary to maintain a special or specific deity was that god's cult, and required the knowledge of giving the gods their due. The noun cultus originates from the past participle of the verb colo, colere, coli, or cultus, to tend, take care of, cultivate, originally meaning to dwell in, inhabit, and thus to tend, cultivate, or to practice agriculture. In the specific context of the Greek hero cult, Carla Antonasia wrote, "The term cult identifies a pattern of ritual behavior in connection with specific objects. Within a framework of special and temporal coordinates, ritual would include, but not necessarily be limited to, prayer, sacrifice, votive offerings, competitions, processions, and construction of monuments." Some degree of recurrence in place and repetition over time of ritual action is necessary for a cult to be enacted or to be practiced. So, what about the cult followings? So, cult following is more of like, when they say a musician has a cult following. So a cult following comprises a group of fans who are highly dedicated to a piece of artwork in various mediums, often referred to as a cult classic. A film, book, musical artist, television series, or video game, among other things, is said to have a cult following when it has a small but very passionate fan base. A common component of cult followings is the emotional attachment the fans have to the object of the cult following, often identifying themselves and other fans as a member of a community. Cult followings are also commonly associated with niche markets. Cult media are often associated with underground culture and are considered too eccentric or subversive to be appreciated by the general public or to be commercially successful. Many cult fans express their devotion with a level of irony when describing entertainment that falls under this realm, in that something is so bad it's good. It sounds like, Ernest Goes to Hollywood or Ernest Does Halloween. Those movies are awful, but they're so bad they're good. Sometimes these cult followings cross the border to camp followings. Many fans have become involved in a subculture of fandom, either via conventions, online communities, or through activities such as writing series-related fiction, costume creation, replica prop, and model building, or creating their own audio or video productions from the formats and characters. There's not always a clear difference between cult and mainstream media. Series such as Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Rocky Horror, Clueless, Ethel and Ernest, The Dark Knight, and Mean Girls attract mass audience but also have core groups of fanatic followers. That's true. Professor Xavier Mendick and Ernest Matthews, authors of 100 Cult Films, argue that the devoted following among these films make them cult classics. In many cases, films that have cult followings may have been financial flops during their theatrical box office run, and even received mixed or mostly negative reviews by mainstream media, but still be considered a major success by small core groups or communities of fans devoted to such films. Some cults are only popular within a certain subculture. The film Woodstock is especially loved within the hippie subculture, while Hocus Pocus holds cult status among American women born in the 1980s. I love that movie. Why is it just American women born in the 1980s? Okay. Certain mainstream icons can become cult icons in a different context for certain people. Reefer Madness was originally intended to warn youth against the use of marijuana, but because of its ridiculous plot, overwhelming amount of factual errors, and cheap look, it is now often watched by audiences of marijuana smokers and has gained a cult following. Quentin Tarantino's films borrow stylistically from classic cult films, but are appreciated by a large audience, and therefore lie somewhere between cult and mainstream. A certain cult phenomena can grow to such proportions that they become mainstream. So I want to read about this Reefer Madness. I've never watched it. Reefer Madness is a 1936 American film about drugs revolving around the melodramatic events that ensue when high school students are lured by pushers to try marijuana. From a hit-and-run accident to manslaughter, suicide, attempted rape, hallucinations, and descent into madness from marijuana addiction. The film was directed by Louis J. Gasnier and featured a cast of mainly little-known actors. Originally financed by a church group under the title Tell Your Children, the film was intended to be shown to parents as a morality tale attempting to teach them about the dangers of cannabis use. Soon after the film was shot, It was purchased by producer Dwayne Esper, who recut the film for distribution on the exploitation film circuit, exploiting vulgar interest while escaping censorship under the guise of moral guidance. Beginning in 1938 to 1939, through the 1940s and 1950s. The film was rediscovered in the early 1970s and gained new life as an unintentional satire among advocates of cannabis policy reform. However, critics have called it one of the worst films ever made. Today it is in the public domain in the United States. That is funny. So, I clicked on the list of films considered the worst films ever made. The films listed below have been cited by a variety of notable critics in varying media sources as being among the worst films ever made. Examples of such sources include Metacritic, Robert Ebert's list of most hated films, the Golden Turkey Awards, Leonard Maltin's Movie Guide, Rotten Tomatoes, the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards, the cult TV series Mystery Science Teacher 3000, and the Golden Raspberry Awards, aka the Razzies. I've heard of the Razzies and obviously Rotten Tomatoes. I think Razzies is where Halle Berry accepted an award for Catwoman, which is hilarious. So films on these lists are generally feature-length films that are commercial/artistic in nature, intended to turn a profit and or express personal statements, professionally or independently produced, as opposed to amateur productions, and released in theaters, then on television, and most recently through on-demand streaming services. So I'm gonna skip to like the 2000s and let's see what's there. Freddy Got Fingered. That's with Tom Green. So the comedy film Freddy Got Fingered stars Tom Green, who also wrote and directed it, featuring largely gross out and shock humor similar to that featured in the Tom Green Show. In the film, Green stars as a 28-year-old slacker and cartoonist who falsely accuses his father of child molestation when he questions his son's life goals. Freddy Got Fingered received overwhelmingly negative reviews, with CNN critic Paul Clinton declaring it, quite simply, the worst movie ever released by a major studio in Hollywood history. Warren Epstein of the Gazette described Freddy Got Fingered as the worst movie ever made. Washington Post said, if ever a movie testified to the utter creative bankruptcy of the Hollywood film industry, it is the abomination known as Freddy Got Fingered. I really didn't like that. What? They have the Master of Disguise on here, which I guess I can kind of see, but that movie was funny when I was little. I was 9 when it came out. I say it was funny, but I remember trying to watch it like 15 times and falling asleep close to the beginning every single time. And I was like 9. That movie should have been exactly what I wanted. I thought it was funny though. Now it's that Turtle movie. The Room. They remade that. That's that Tommy Wiseau. Yeah. There's Catwoman. If you want to see just how bad Catwoman was, maybe you didn't watch it back then, just go type in Catwoman basketball scene. And even if you remember it as being a cool scene or something, go back and watch it. It's terrible. It's so bad. But because of that, we can skip to Batman. So Batman is a fictional superhero appearing in American comic books published by DC Comics. The character was created by Bob Kane and writer Bill Finger and first appeared in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939. Originally named the Batman, and there's a hyphen between Batman. The character is also referred to by such epithets as the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight, and the world's greatest detective. Batman's secret identity, Bruce Wayne, a wealthy American playboy, philanthropist, and owner of Wayne Enterprises. Batman originated from an incident in Bruce's childhood after witnessing the murder of his parents, Dr. Thomas Wayne and Martha Wayne. He swore vengeance against criminals, an oath tempered by a sense of justice. Bruce trains himself physically and intellectually and crafts a bat-inspired persona to fight crime. Batman operates in the fictional Gotham City with assistance from various supporting characters, including his butler Alfred, police commissioner Jim Gordon, and vigilante allies such as Robin. Unlike most superheroes, Batman does not possess any inhuman superpowers. However, he does possess a genius-level intellect and is a peerless martial artist, and his vast wealth affords him an extraordinary arsenal of weaponry and equipment. A large assortment of villains make up Batman's rogue gallery, including his nemesis, the Joker. The Joker is a supervillain created by Bill Finger, Bob Kane, and Jerry Robinson, who first appeared in the debut issue of the comic book Batman, April 25th, 1940, published by DC Comics. Credit for the Joker's creation is disputed. Kane and Robinson claim responsibility for the Joker's design, while acknowledging Finger's writing contribution. Although the Joker was planned to be killed off during his initial appearance, he was spared by editorial intervention, allowing the character to endure as the archenemy of the superhero Batman. In his comic book appearances, the Joker is portrayed as a criminal mastermind. Introduced as a psychopath with a warped, sadistic sense of humor, the character became a goofy prankster in the late 1950s in response to regulation by the Comics Code Authority, before returning to his darker roots during the early 1970s. As Batman's nemesis, the Joker has been a part of these superheroes defining stories, including the murder of Jason Todd, the second Robin, and Batman's ward, and the paralysis of one of Batman's allies, Barbara Gordon. The Joker has had various possible origin stories during his decades of appearances. The most common story involves him falling into a tank of chemical waste that bleaches his skin white and turns his hair green and lips bright red. The resulting disfigurement drives him insane. The antithesis of Batman in personality and appearance, the Joker is considered by critics to be his perfect adversary. The Joker possesses no superhuman abilities, instead uses his expertise in chemical engineering to develop poisonous or lethal concoctions and thematic weaponry, including razor-tipped playing cards, deadly joy buzzers, and acid-spraying lapel flowers. The Joker sometimes works with other Gotham City supervillains such as the Penguin and Two-Face, and groups like the Injustice Gang and Injustice League, but these relationships often collapse due to Joker's desire for unbridled chaos. The 1990s introduced a romantic interest for the Joker in his former psychiatrist Harley Quinn, who becomes his villainous sidekick. Although his primary obsession is Batman, the Joker has also fought other heroes, including Superman and Wonder Woman. One of the most iconic characters in pop culture, the Joker has been listed among the greatest comic book villains and fictional characters ever created. The character's popularity has seen him appear on a variety of merchandise such as clothing and collectible items, inspire real-world structures such as theme park attractions, and be referenced in a number of media. The Joker has been adapted to serve as Batman's adversary in live-action, animated, and video game incarnations, including the 1960s Batman television series played by Cesar Romero, and in films by Jack Nicholson in Batman, 1989, Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, 2008, Joaquin Phoenix in 2019. Ledger and Phoenix each earned an Academy Award for their portrayals. Mark Hamill, Troy Baker, and others have provided the characters' voices. I didn't know that Mark Hamill did his voice, but I don't really watch a lot of superhero stuff. So, I guess since we're talking about the Joker, I'm going to read about psychopathy. So psychopathy is traditionally a personality disorder characterized by persistent antisocial behavior, impaired empathy and remorse, and bold, disinhibited, and egotistical traits. It is sometimes considered synonymous with sociopathy. Different conceptions of psychopathy have been used throughout history that are only partly overlapping and may sometimes be contradictory. So I think the difference between psychopathy and sociopathy is, like, a psychopath is changed throughout their life, like they endured something, and sociopaths are born that way, or it might be opposite. Hopefully this will tell me. So signs of psychopathy, starting in childhood. So this is a PCL-YV is an adaptation of the PCLR for individuals aged 13 to 18 years. It is like the PCLR done by a trained rater based on an interview and an examination of criminal and other records. The antisocial process screening device, APSD, is also an adaptation of the PCLR. It can be administered by parents or teachers for individuals aged 6 to 13 years. High psychopathy scores for both juveniles as measured with these instruments and adults as measured with the PCLR and other measurement tools have similar associations with other variables, including similar ability in predicting violence and criminality. Conduct disorder is diagnosed based on a prolonged pattern of antisocial behavior in childhood and or adolescence, and may be seen as a precursor to ASPD. Some researchers have speculated that there are two subtypes of conduct disorder which mark dual development pathways to adult psychopathy. The DSM allows differentiating between childhood onset before age 10 and adolescent onset at age 10 and later. Childhood onset is argued to be more due to a personality disorder caused by neurological deficits interacting with an adverse environment. For many, but not all, childhood onset is associated with what is in Terry Moffat's developmental theory of crime, referred to as life course persistent. Antisocial behavior as well as poor health and economic status. Adolescent onset is argued to more typically be associated with short-term antisocial behavior. So in fiction, characters are often portrayed in an exaggerated fashion, and typically in the role of a villain or anti-hero, where the general characteristics and stereotypes associated with psychopathy are useful to facilitate conflict and danger. Because the definitions, criteria, and popular conceptions throughout its history have varied over the years and continue to change even now, many of the characters characterized as psychopathic in notable works at the time of publication may no longer fit the current definition and conception of psychopathy. There are several archetypal images of psychopathy in both lay and professional accounts, which only partly overlap and can involve contradictory traits. The charming con artist, the deranged serial killer, and mass murderer, the callous and scheming business person, and the chronic low-level offender and juvenile delinquent. The public concept reflects some combination of fear of a mythical boogeyman, the disgust and intrigue surrounding evil, and fascination and sometimes perhaps envy of people who might appear to go through life without attachments and encumbered by guilt, anguish, or insecurity. So the boogeyman is a mythical creature used by adults to frighten children into good behavior. The boogeyman has no specific appearance, and conceptions vary drastically by household and culture, but is commonly depicted as a masculine or androgynous monster that punishes children for misbehavior. The boogeyman or a somewhat related creature can be found in every culture. Boogeyman may target a specific act or general misbehavior, depending on what purpose needs serving, often based on a warning from the child's authority figure. The term boogeyman is often used as a nonspecific personification for terror, and in some cases, the devil. So the etymology, the word boogie is believed to be derived from the Middle English or boogie, something frightening, or scarecrow. Theories on its origin include a root meaning goat, or a cognate of the German boogie, Bugelmann, goblin. It could be influenced in meaning by Old English Buddha, used in compounds for beetle. A related word, bugbear, from bug meaning goblin, or scarecrow, and bear, was imagined as a demon in the form of a bear that eats small children. It was also used to mean a general object of dread. The word boogaboo, with a similar pair of meanings, may have arisen as an alliteration of bugbear. So, in other cultures, El Coco is a monster common to many Spanish-speaking countries. In Spain, parents will sing lullabies or tell rhymes to children, warning them that if they do not sleep, El Coco will come get them. The rhyme originated in the 17th century and has evolved over the years, but still retains its original meaning. Coconuts received that name because the hairy brown face created by the coconut shell's 3 indentations reminded the Portuguese sailors of cocoa. Latin America also has El Coco, although its folklore is usually quite different, commonly mixed with native beliefs, and because of cultural contacts, sometimes more related to the boogeyman of the United States. However, the term El Coco is also used in Spanish-speaking Latin American countries, such as Bolivia, Colombia, Guatemala, Peru, Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and Venezuela. Although there it is more usually called El Cuco, as in Puerto Rico, Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina. Among Mexican Americans, El Cucuy is portrayed as an evil monster that hides under children's beds at night and kidnaps or eats the child that does not obey his or her parents or go to sleep when it is time to do so. However, the Spanish-American boogeyman does not resemble the shapeless or hairy monster of Spain. Social sciences professor Manuel Medrano says popular legend describes El Cucuy as a small humanoid with glowing red eyes that hides in closets or under the bed. Some lore has him as a kid who was the victim of violence, and now he's alive, but he's not, Medrano said, citing Xavier Garza's 2004 book, Creepy Creatures and Other Cucuys. Argentina, officially the Argentine Republic, is a country located mostly in the southern half of South America. Sharing the bulk of the southern core with Chile to the west, the country is also bordered by Bolivia and Paraguay to the north, Brazil to the northeast, Uruguay to the South Atlantic Ocean to the east, and the South Atlantic Ocean to the east, and the Drake Passage to the south. With a mainland area of 2,780,400 kilometers squared, Argentina is the 8th largest country in the world, the 4th largest in the Americas, and 2nd largest in South America after Brazil, and the largest Spanish-speaking nation. The sovereign state is subdivided into 23 provinces and 1 autonomous city, Buenos Aires, and a sovereign state in international law is a political entity that is represented by one centralized government that has sovereignty over a geographic area. International law defines sovereign states as having a permanent population, defined territory, one government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other sovereign states. It is also normally understood that a sovereign state is neither dependent on nor subjected to any other power or state. According to the declarative theory of statehood, a sovereign state can exist without being recognized by other sovereign states. Unrecognized states will often find it difficult to exercise full treaty-making powers or engage in diplomatic relations with other sovereign states. Westphalian sovereignty is a concept of nation-state sovereignty based on territoriality and the absence of a role for external agents in domestic structures. It is an international system of states multinational corporations, and other organizations that began with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Sovereignty is a term that is frequently misused. Up until the 19th century, the radicalized concept of a standard of civilization was routinely deployed to determine that certain people in the world were uncivilized and lacking organized societies. I guess that's how they use, third world country and first world country now. So, that position was reflected and constituted in the notion that their sovereignty was either completely lacking or at least of an inferior character when compared to that of the civilized people. Lasse Oppenheim said, "There exists perhaps no conception, the meaning of which is more controversial than that of sovereignty. It is an indisputable fact that this conception, from the moment when it was introduced into political science until the present day, has never had a meaning which was universally agreed upon." In the opinion of H.V. Evatt of the High Court of Australia, sovereignty is neither a question of fact nor a question of law, but a question that does not arise at all. Sovereignty has taken on a different meaning with the development of the principle of self-determination and the prohibition against the threat or use of force as juez cogens, whatever that means, of modern international law. The United Nations Charter, the Draft Declaration on Rights and Duties of States, and the charters of regional international organizations express the view that all states are juridically equal and enjoy the same rights and duties based upon the mere fact of their existence as persons under international law. The right of nations to determine their own political status and exercise permanent sovereignty within the limits of their territorial jurisdictions is widely recognized. In political science, sovereignty is usually defined as the most essential attribute of the state in the form of its complete self-sufficiency in the frames of a certain territory, that is, its supremacy in the domestic policy and independence in the foreign one. Named after the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, the Westphalia system of state sovereignty, which according to Brian Turner is made a more or less clear separation between religion and state, and recognized the right of princes to confessionalize the state, that is, to determine the religious affiliation of their kingdoms on the pragmatic principle of cuis regio eius religio, whose realm his religion. Before 1900, sovereign states enjoyed an absolute immunity from the judicial process, derived from the concept of sovereignty and the Westphalia equality of states. First articulated by Jean Bodin, the powers of the state are considered to be suprema potestas within territorial boundaries. Based on this, the jurisprudence has developed along the lines of affording immunity from prosecution to foreign states in domestic courts. In the Schroeder Exchange versus McFadden, Chief Justice John Marshall of the United States Supreme Court wrote that the perfect equality and absolute independence of sovereigns has created a class of cases where every sovereign is understood to waive the exercise of a part of that complete exclusive territorial jurisdiction, which has been stated to be the attribute of every nation. Absolute sovereign immunity is no longer as widely accepted as it has been in the past, and some countries, including the United States, Canada, Singapore, Australia, Pakistan, and South Africa, have introduced restrictive immunity by statute, which explicitly limits jurisdictional immunity to public acts, but not private or commercial ones, though there is no precise definition by which public acts can easily be distinguished from the private ones. So, international treaty law comprises obligations expressly and voluntarily accepted by sovereign states between themselves in treaties. A treaty is a formal written agreement entered into by actors in international law, namely sovereign states and international organizations. A treaty may also be known as an international agreement, protocol, covenant, convention, pact, or exchange of letters, among other terms. Regardless of terminology, only instruments that are binding upon the parties are considered treaties subject to international law. Treaties can be loosely compared to contracts in that the parties willingly assume binding obligations among themselves, and any party that breaches its obligations can be held liable under international law. Treaties vary significantly in substance and complexity, and may govern a wide variety of matters, such as territorial boundaries, trade and commerce, political alliances, and more. International law and treaties have mostly been codified by the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which sets forth the rules and procedures for creating, enforcing, amending, and interpreting treaties. As one of the earliest manifestations of international relations, treaties are recognized as a primary source of international law. The Treaty of Versailles was the most important of the peace treaties that brought World War I to an end. The treaty ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. It was signed on 28 June 1919 in Versailles, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which had led directly to the war. The other Central Powers on the German side signed separate treaties, although the armistice signed on 11 November 1918 ended the actual fighting. It took 6 months of Allied negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference to conclude the peace treaty. The treaty was registered by the Secretariat of the League of Nations on 21 October 1919. Of the many provisions in the treaty, one of the most important and controversial required Germany to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage. During the war, the other members of the Central Powers signed treaties containing similar articles. This article, Article 231, later became known as the War Guilt Clause. The treaty required Germany to disarm, make ample territorial concessions, and pay reparations to certain countries that had formed the Entente powers. In 1921, the total cost of these reparations was assessed at 132 billion marks, then $31.4 billion, or 6.6 billion pounds, roughly equivalent to 442 billion, or 284 billion in 2020. 284 billion pounds, 442 billion US dollars. At the time, economists, notably John Maynard Keynes, a British delegate to the Paris Peace Conference, predicted that the treaty was too harsh, a Carthaginian peace, and said that the reparations figure was excessive and counterproductive, views that since then have been the subject of ongoing debate by historians and economists. So a Carthaginian peace is the imposition of a very brutal peace, quotes, achieved by completely crushing the enemy. The term derives from the peace imposed on Carthage by Rome. After the Second Punic War, Carthage lost all its colonies, was forced to demilitarize, and pay constant tribute to Rome, and could enter war only with Rome's permission. At the end of the Third Punic War, the Romans systematically burned Carthage to the ground and enslaved its population. So after the end of the Third Punic War, the Romans laid siege to Carthage. When they took the city, they killed most of its inhabitants, sold the rest into slavery, and destroyed the entire city. There is no ancient evidence for modern accounts that the Romans sowed the ground with salt. By extension, a Carthaginian peace can refer to any brutal peace treaty demanding total subjugation of the defeated side. The Third Punic War was the third and last of the Punic Wars fought between the former Phoenician colony of Carthage and the Roman Republic. The Punic Wars were named because of the Roman name for Carthaginians, which is Punici, or Ponici. The war was a much smaller engagement than the two previous Punic Wars and focused on Tunisia, mainly on the siege of Carthage, which resulted in the complete destruction of the city, the annexation of all remaining Carthaginian territory by Rome, and the death or enslavement of the entire Carthaginian population. The Third Punic War ended Carthage's independent existence, though the Punic language continued to be spoken in northern Africa until the 5th century AD. In the years between the Second and Third Punic War, Rome was engaged in the conquest of Hellenistic empires, and also of the Illyrian tribes to the east, and suppressing the Hispanian peoples in the west, although they had been essential to the Roman success in the Second Punic War. Carthage, stripped of allies and territory, was suffering under a large indemnity of 200 silver talents to be paid every year for 50 years. According to the Appian, the senator Cato the Elder usually finished his speeches on any subject in the senates with the phrase Ceterum censeo Carthaginium esse delendum, which means, moreover, I am of the opinion that Carthage ought to be destroyed. And I read about this before in a past episode, and I'm pretty sure it's the same guy. He would, no matter what speech he was saying, no matter what speech he was giving, he would end it with that, with moreover, I am of the opinion that Carthage ought to be destroyed. Cicero attributed a similar statement to Cato in his dialogue De Sinucete. He was opposed by the senator Publius Cornelius Scipio Narcissa Corculum, who favored a different course that would not destroy Carthage, and who usually prevailed in his debates. The peace treaty at the end of the Second Punic War required that all border disputes involving Carthage be attributed by the Roman Senate, and required Carthage to get explicit Roman approval before going to war. As a result, in the 50 intervening years between the Second and Third Punic War, Carthage had to take all border disputes with Rome's ally Numidia to the Roman Senate, where they were decided almost exclusively in Numidian favor. In 151 BC, the Carthaginian debt to Rome was fully repaid, meaning that, in Punic eyes, the treaty was now expired, though not so according to the Romans, who instead viewed the treaty as a permanent declaration of Carthaginian subordination to Rome, akin to the Roman treaties with its Italian allies. Moreover, the retirement of the indemnity removed one of the main incentives the Romans had to keep the peace with Carthage. There were no further payments that might be interrupted. The Romans had other reasons to conquer Carthage and her remaining territories. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the population of the city of Rome was about 400,000 and rising. Feeding the growing populace was becoming a major challenge. The farmland surrounding Carthage represented the most productive, most accessible, and perhaps the most easily obtainable agricultural land not yet under Roman control. In 151 BC, Numidia launched another border raid on Carthaginian soil, besieging the Punic town of Oroscopa, and Carthage launched a large military expedition, which was 25,000 soldiers, to repel the Numidian invaders. However, Carthage suffered a military defeat and was charged with another 50-year debt to Numidia. Immediately after, however, Rome showed displeasure with Carthage's decision to wage war against its neighbor without Roman consent. In 149 BC, Rome declared war against Carthage. The Carthaginians made a series of attempts to appease Rome and received a promise that if 300 children of well-born Carthaginians were sent as hostages to Rome, the Carthaginians would keep the rights to their land and self-government. Even after this was done, the allied Punic city of Utica defected to Rome, and a Roman army of 80,000 men gathered there. The consuls then demanded that Carthage hand over all weapons and armor. After those had been handed over, Rome additionally demanded that the Carthaginians move at least 16 kilometers inland, while the city was to be burned. When the Carthaginians learned of this, they abandoned negotiations, and the city was immediately besieged, beginning the Third Punic War. So after they gave up their weapons and their armor, now they decide to fight back. After the main Roman expedition landed at Utica, consuls Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorius launched a two-pronged attack on Carthage. but were eventually repulsed by the army of Carthaginian generals. Censorius lost more than 500 men when they were surprised by the Carthaginian cavalry while collecting timber around the Lake of Tunis. A worse disaster fell upon the Romans when their fleet was set ablaze by fireships, which the Carthaginians released upwind. I want to read about those. A fireship, used in the days of wooden rowed or sailing ships, was a ship filled with combustibles or gunpowder, deliberately set on fire, and steered into an enemy fleet, in order to destroy ships or to create panic and make the enemy break formation. Ships used as fireships were either warships whose munitions were fully spent in battle, surplus ones which were old and worn out, or inexpensive purpose-built vessels rigged to be set afire, steered towards targets, and abandoned quickly by the crew. Explosion ships, or hell burners, were a variation on the fire ship, intended to cause damage by blowing up in proximity to enemy ships. Fire ships were used to great effect by the outgunned English fleet against the Spanish Armada during the Battle of Gravelines, the Dutch raid on the Medway, and by the Greeks in the Greek War of Independence. Possibly the oldest account of the military use of a fire ship is recorded by the Greek historian Thucydides on the occasion of the failed Athenian Sicilian expedition. In the episode, the Athenian expeditionary force successfully repels an attack by the Syracusans. The rest of the Athenian force, the enemy, tried to burn by means of an old merchantman, which they filled with faggots and pine wood, set on fire and let drift down the wind, which blew full on the Athenians. The Athenians, however, alarmed for their ships, contrived means for stopping it and putting it out, and checking the flames in the nearer approach of the merchantmen, thus escaped the danger. A fireship was used in the Battle of Red Cliffs on the Yangtze River, when Huang Gai assaulted Cao Cao's naval forces with a fireship filled with bundles of kindling, dry reeds, and fatty oil. Fireships were decisively employed by the Vandals against the armada sent by the Eastern Roman Empire in the Battle of Cape Bon. The invention of Greek fire in 673 increased the use of fireships, at first by the Greeks and afterward by other nations, as they came into possession of the secret of manufacturing the substance. In 951 and again in 953, Russian fleets narrowly escaped destruction by fireships. While fireships were used in the medieval period, notably during the Crusades, these were typically ships that were set up with combustibles on an ad hoc basis. The career of the modern fireship, as a Navy vessel type designed for this particular function and made a permanent addition to a fleet, roughly parallels the era of cannon-armed sailing ships, beginning with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and lasting until the British victory over the Turks at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. The first modern fireships were put to use in early 17th century Dutch and Spanish fleet actions during the 30 Years' War. Their use increased throughout the century, with purpose-built fireships, a permanent part of many naval fleets, ready to be deployed whenever necessary. Initially, small and often obsolete smaller warships were chosen as fireships, but by 1700, the fireships were being purpose-built with specific features for their role. Most were adaptations of the usual small warships of the day, brigs or ship-rigged sloops of war, with between 10 and 16 guns. The practical design features of the purpose-built fireships included a lattice-work false deck below the planks of the main deck. The planks would be removed and the combustibles and explosives stacked on the lattice, which gave good draught and ensured the fire would hold and spread. A number of square-section chimneys would be let into the forecastle and quarterdeck to also help ensure a good draught for the fire. The gun ports would be hinged at the bottom rather than the top as on the other warships, so that they would be kept open by gravity rather than ropes, which would otherwise burn thorough, further ensuring a good air supply. On the other hand, the lower parts of the mast would be surrounded by coffer dams to ensure that the fire would not bring down the mast prematurely and thus deprive the fireship of motive power. Grappling hooks would be fitted to the ends of the yard arms so that the fireship would become entangled in its target's rigging. A large sallyport door was let into the rear quarter of the ship, usually the starboard side, to allow easy exit for the crew once the fire had been set and lit. There was often a chain fixed here for mooring the escape boat rather than a rope that may have been damaged by the fire. Because fireships were used relatively rarely and only in specific tactical conditions even in their heyday, and there were always demand for small cruisers and warships, most purpose-built fireships served long careers as ordinary warships without ever being used for their actual purpose. Of the 5 fireships used in Holmes's bonfire of 1666, 3 had been in service with the Royal Navy for over a decade before being deployed on their final mission. While only used sparingly during the Napoleonic Wars, fireships as a distant class were part of the British Royal Navy until 1808, at which point the use of permanently designated fireships attached to British squadrons disappeared. Fireships continued to be used, sometimes to great effect, such as by the U.S. Navy at the Battle of Tripoli Harbor in 1804, and by the British Navy's Thomas Cochrane at the Battle of Basque Roads in 1809. But for the most part, they were considered an obsolete weapon by the early 19th century. Warships of the Age of Sail were highly vulnerable to fire. Made of wood with seams caulked with tar, ropes greased with fat, and stores of gunpowder, there was little that would not burn. Accidental fires destroyed many ships, so fireships presented a terrifying threat. With the wind in exactly the right direction, a fireship could be cast loose and allowed to drift onto its target, but in most battles, fireships were equipped with skeleton crews to steer the ship to the target. The crew were expected to abandon ship at the last moment and escape in the ship's boat. Fireships were most devastating against fleets, which were at anchor or otherwise restricted in movement. At sea, a well-handled ship could evade a fireship and disable it with a cannon fire. Other tactics were to fire at the ship's boats and other vessels in the vicinity, so that the crew could not escape and therefore might decide not to ignite the ship, or to wait until the fireship had been abandoned and then tow it aside with small maneuverable vessels such as galleys. The role of incendiary vessels changed throughout the age of the modern fireship. The systematic use of fireships as part of naval actions peaked through the Third Anglo-Dutch War, whereas just 20 years before a naval fleet might have 6 to 7 fireships. By the Battle of Solebay in 1672, both the Dutch and English fleets employed typically between 20 and 30 fireships, and sometimes more. By this time, however, admirals and captains had become very experienced with the limitations of fireship attacks and had learned how to avoid them during battle. Great numbers of fireships were expended during the Third Dutch War without destroying enemy men of war, and fireships had become a way to harass and annoy the enemy rather than destroy him. The successful use of fireships at the Battle of La Hougue and Cherbourg in 1692 marked both the greatest achievement of a fireship attack since the Spanish Armada and also the last significant success for fireships. Though fireships as a specified class sailed with the British Royal Navy for another century, they would never have a significant impact on a naval victory. Once the most feared weapons in Navy arsenals, fireships had declined in both importance and numbers, so that by the mid-18th century only 5 to 6 British fireships would be at sea at a time. And the Royal Navy attempted only 4 attacks using modern fireships between 1697 and 1800. Wow, so 100 years. And they only used 4 attacks. Hastily outfitted ad hoc fireships continued to be used in naval warfare. For example, a large number of fire rafts were used in mostly ineffective attacks on the British fleet by American forces during the American Revolution at Philadelphia, on the Hudson River, and elsewhere. The end of the modern fireship came in the early 19th century, when the British began to use hastily outfitted fireships at engagements such as Boulogne and Dunkirk, despite the presence of purpose-built fireships in the fleet. The last modern fireship in the British Royal Navy was Theus, the only designated fireship out of the entire Navy of 638 warships when she was converted to a ship sloop in 1808. And just like the fireships, I think this is a good time to go ahead and end this episode. Wow, we were all over the place this episode, which is kind of what I want, so that's good. We learned about Batman, the Joker, Psychopaths, the Third Punic War, fireships, sovereign states, peace treaties, a little bit about the Treaty of Versailles, just all over the place. So if you liked